most of you know, you're all got strong military affiliations, that recruiters, whether in the Army, Marines, Navy, Coast Guard, or anything else, they're all extremely creative. They're all extremely truthful all the time. And about 1967, some enterprising Marine recruiting NCO got the idea, hey, let's create a platoon of Marines and we'll get them introduced at a Twins baseball game. Here to tell us what happened when he did that is Christy Sauro, our speaker. Christy?
I want you to know I'm very honored to be here speaking to a group of military officers. I would like to share with you how I, as an enlisted man, viewed you as officers. And I want to tell you about some of my own personal experience with officers. I think you're going to like what you hear. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the book, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about has a connection to the book. The title of the book is The Twins Platoon, an epic story of young Marines at war in Vietnam. It's nonfiction, and it was published in 2006. And I would be amiss if I didn't mention it. Another one of our Twins Platoon members is here, as you might know, Russ Admonson. And I want you to know, I know Russ, he's the real deal. He's a Marine. He fought in the Battle of Way City, which was a major battle in Vietnam, and he was wounded. And anyhow, he's the real deal. So the story of the Twins Platoon, it's a true story about a group of young men, mostly teenagers, fresh out of high school, who were sworn into the Marine Corps at a Minnesota Twins baseball game on June 28, 1967. And the book is divided into 3 parts, and it tells what happened to them chronologically. Part 1 is before Vietnam. That part follows them through their Marine Corps training, starting with boot camp, then infantry training, and finally their advanced training. Part 2 is in Vietnam, and it tells what happened to them in Vietnam, where they fought in many major battles, like Tet of 1968, Khe Sanh, Battle of Way City, which Russ was in, and the Battle of Dai Do. It tells about the day-to-day fighting and what it was like for them based upon what their MOSs were. And part 3 is after Vietnam. This part reveals what they experienced when they came home. It tells about their readjustment to civilian life and what it was like for their family and loved ones. It is perhaps one of the most heart-wrenching and uplifting parts of the book. Because the book is nonfiction, the story of the Twins Platoon involves the other branches of service, the Army, Air Force, and Navy, and it tells about their fine service. Now I would like for you to think back to all those enlisted men who saluted you. Were they doing it out of respect or because they had to? I can tell you that based upon my experiences, they were doing it out of respect. This is an example of an officer who has earned a great deal of respect. The excerpt I will read about him comes from the book in chapter 18, The Battle of Dai Do. In this battle, the understrength 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, consisting of 4 rifle companies with fewer than 700 men, stopped and drove back the entire 320th NVA Division, which consisted of more than 7,000 enemy soldiers. Sadly, many of the Marines were killed in action, and some 397 were wounded. About 300 of those were medevaced to the USS Iwo Jima, along with their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Weiss, who was also wounded in battle. This is the excerpt from the book about him. A bullet from an AK-47 had penetrated his flak jacket and was lodged between the 3rd and 4th vertebrae of his spine. The pain of his injury was minuscule compared to the pain of having lost so many men. He took it upon himself to go and visit every wounded Marine in the infirmary. It was a monumental task, even for somebody with two good legs. In 2013, a book by Mark Huffman was published about Lieutenant Colonel William Weiss. The title of it was One Magnificent Bastard, Brigadier General William Weiss, USMC, retired. One of the reasons the Marines won the Battle of Dido was due to the actions of another great officer, Major General James E. Livingston. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his role at the Battle of Dido. In 2010, a book was published about him entitled Noble Warrior, the story of Major General James E. Livingston. My first perception of an officer came about when our drill instructors made it very clear that officers were in a special class way above us. Officers were to be addressed as sir and saluted. An exception to that was in areas of combat. Saluting an officer in an area of combat would be like putting a target on their backs, because our enemy knew our officers were the leaders of our Marines, of our troops. My second perception of an officer came when I was sent to Vietnam and assigned to Helicopter Squadron HMM 362. All the pilots, all of them, were officers. That in and of itself was very telling. Over the next 13 months, I witnessed how courageous and brave those officers were. My third perception of an officer came from working with officers. To be more specific, my MOS was 0431 embarkation, which has to do with the deployment of a unit from point A to point B. To do that takes preparation, planning, and supervision, which is what the job of embarkation is all about. Our helicopter squadron had one embarkation officer and one embarkation assistant. I was the squadron embarkation assistant, which was an enlisted man's position. We were all assigned primary and secondary duties. My job as the embarkation assistant was my primary duty. The job of the embarkation officer was his secondary duty, because the embarkation officer's primary duty was that of being a helicopter pilot. My first embarkation officer was Captain Feeney. I didn't see much of him because of all the heavy fighting that was occurring in early 1968. I seem to recall the rumors that he had been shot down twice and survived. Then one day I told I would be working for a different embarkation officer. My second embarkation officer was Lieutenant Peter Shriver. He had a significant impact on my life, and I wrote about it in the book. I think it's fitting that I give you more of the details about how this officer changed my life for the better. I'm going to tell you about things I have not talked about publicly before with any other group, and these details are not in the book. My life-changing experience started with the S4 officer, Captain McCarthy, telling me that the squadron did not have an embarkation SOP and that I needed to make one. When I asked him what an SOP was, he replied, SOP stood for Standing Operating Procedures. When I asked him, how do I do that? He said something like, I don't know, you're the one that went to embarkation school, you figure it out. After I looked at other SOPs, I created one for the embarkation of our squadron. I had to wait to show it to Lieutenant Shriver because his primary duty as a helicopter pilot was keeping him very busy. Still, he frequently would check in with me to see how things were going. When I did show him the SOP I had created for the squadron, he reviewed it. After he finished looking it over, he asked me why I was not an officer. The only thing that came to my mind was a recollection that officers were college educated. So I replied that I did not have a college education. His reaction was for me a defining moment. He did not say a word. He just shook his head in disappointment and looked so sad. His negative reaction spoke volumes to me. For the first time in my life, it really hit home the importance of going to college. He made me realize that not having a college education closed the doors to many future opportunities. His disappointment in my not having gone to college made me decide that if I got out of Vietnam alive, I would pursue getting a college education. After I completed my tour of duty in Vietnam, I was stationed at the El Toro Marine Base in Southern California, where I took advantage of a military tuition assistance program. Before my discharge, I had completed 2 years of college. After being discharged from active duty, I returned to Minnesota and earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Minnesota in June of 1973. Within a couple months of graduating, I interviewed with Mutual Service Insurance for a job as an insurance agent, which required a college degree, and I was hired. Perhaps you are wondering if I chose the right path in life, which is a path that probably would not have been there if it were not for Lieutenant Shriver. I can tell you this, that I never changed jobs. 47 years later in 2020, I retired from my job as an insurance agent. It was a job that allowed me to achieve all my life goals and ambitions. I've had a happy and fulfilling life. I believe many of you in this room have also changed the lives of the men who served under you for the better, but you may not know it. The person who benefited from your leadership may have never told you. I know that I never told Lieutenant Shriver about how he changed my life for the better by influencing me to go to college. But years later, I did get the opportunity to tell his parents, both in a letter and later in person. You just need to think back and fill in the blanks with the names of those who are under your command. Think about those enlisted men who listened attentively to your words of wisdom. Whether they told you so or not, it's likely you had a positive influence on their future lives. Now I want to share with you what made me want to write the book and my rewards for doing so, in hopes that you may benefit from this information in some way. All my life I had been taught about God in one way or another. I had a religious upbringing. There seemed to be references to God everywhere. Even the recruits' creed in boot camp stated, to be a Marine, you have to believe in yourself, your fellow Marine, your Corps, your country, and your God. But for me, there was nothing personal about God until October of 1984. That's when I had my first meaningful religious experience, and I write about it in chapter 26, One Nation Under God. If you read that chapter, I think you'll have a much better understanding of what I'm talking about. It was soon after having that meaningful religious experience that the idea came to me to write a book about the twins platoon. When I thought about it, I realized what a massive undertaking that would be. I figured it would take years and maybe a lifetime to do it, and with no guarantees that anybody would ever publish it or that anyone would want to read it. So I dismissed the idea. But the idea would not go away. Over the next 6 years, I became increasingly inspired to take on the challenge. In July of 1990, I set out and conducted the first of many interviews. For the next 15 years, I worked an average of 40 hours a week to complete the manuscript. It consumed about 17,000 hours of my time, and I never tired or gave up working on it. I was continually motivated by how things always seemed to fall in place, from finding lost documents to tracking down people. The results were always the same. I always ended up with whatever I needed. By the year 2000, I became so convinced that the publication of the book was inevitable, I went public expressing this view to more than 100 people over the next 3 years, which was really out of character for me to do that kind of thing. I even wrote in a Christmas letter in December of 2002 that I felt very strongly that the manuscript will one day be published. At times, it seemed to have a life of its own. What I'm going to tell you next is based upon my interpretation of some events that have occurred in my life as a result of writing the book. I believe that the Lord called upon me to write the book. I know now that it says in the Bible, the Lord calls on everyone, so I know I'm not anyone special. My belief is based upon faith, because I can't prove my belief is correct. This is just like I believe that the sun will rise tomorrow. That belief is based on all my education, knowledge, and life experiences. I believe that the sun will rise tomorrow. I have faith that the sun will rise tomorrow. But don't ask me to prove that the sun will rise tomorrow, because I can't. Now, if you are willing to accept my belief that I accepted the Lord's call, do you think God would reward me? And if so, what do you think his reward would be? Keep in mind, I worked on the manuscript for 40 hours a week for 15 years. So what would be a good reward? I'll give you a few seconds to think about this, and then you can find out if you were right. Perhaps some of you may have thought a good reward would be fame or fortune. I believe I was rewarded with something different. After the book was published in 2006, I started to receive many emails, letters, and correspondence from people who had communicated to me how their lives were changed for the better in some way as a result of reading the book. To get that kind of correspondence was very rewarding. I think all of us want to know that we've accomplished something good with our lives. We want to know that our existence has served some purpose. So when I got all this correspondence, I felt very good. I figured that was my reward for writing the book. But then something happened in October of 2008 that changed my mind. I now believe that the Lord rewarded me in another way that was better than anything that I could have ever imagined. What happened is that my son, Chris III, accidentally shot himself in the leg up in his deer stand when he was deer hunting on our property. The bullet entered his leg above the knee and came out the side of his leg. The exit wound was the largest that the doctor working at the Gunshot Trauma Center at North Memorial Hospital had ever seen. A large section of his femoral artery was gone. His injury and what it would take to save him required an experimental surgery, which was reported upon by Boyd Hooper in a Carrie 11 News broadcast. This is what happened. I was working in the garage when I heard the gunshot and my son scream, "Dad." I knew something really bad had just happened, and I took off running to where his deer stand was on the property. Every so often as I was running through the woods to the deer stand, I would yell, "Chris, I'm coming." When I got to the deer stand, I could see blood all over the ground. And my son was up in the deer stand, sitting slumped back against the tree. I quickly climbed up the tree and got on the platform. I saw my son's wound. Because I had written the book, I knew exactly what to look for and what to do when I reached my son. It turned out my son's wound was very similar to that of Twins platoon member Jerry Balte's, which I wrote about in chapter 22. And so was the shape my son was in. Just like Balti's in the book, my son was in critical condition, having lost so much blood. And just like in the Marine in the book, who came to Balti's aid and stopped the bleeding, which saved his life, I was able to do the same for my son. That is because when you write a book, you have to write and rewrite and edit and edit and edit over and over and over. The actions I needed to take when I got to my son had become so memorized from working on the book that everything I did was just automatic. I now believe my real reward for writing the book was that it helped to prepare me to save my son's life. Did anyone of you think of that as a possible reward? Or did anyone of you think of a better reward than that? Now there's more to this story. What happened next, I have not spoken about publicly with any other group. In fact, when Carrie Levin was doing their news story, my son called me from the hospital to say they wanted to interview me too. I did not go. I was not prepared to talk about what happened after I applied the tourniquet to my son's leg. It was something so unbelievable that I did not know how to talk about it. I feared people would not believe me. I feared they might think I was mentally unstable. So up until now, I've only shared what happened with a few people. It was mainly those people in my inner circle who I knew would believe me. What I tried to use first as a tourniquet was my belt, but the holds did not line up right, and the belt was too loose. So I left it buckled on his leg and took off my sweatshirt and used the sleeves to make an effective tourniquet. After I applied the tourniquet and stopped the bleeding, my son said, "Dad, I think I'm going to pass out." And then he passed out and fell over backwards off the platform. His feet went straight up in the air and he was falling headfirst toward the ground. I thought he was going to hit the ground and break his neck, which would either kill him or leave him paralyzed. As my son was falling downward, I quickly reached out with my right hand and tried to grab a hold of him. And with my left hand, I reached back and tried to grab a hold of the tree. What I grabbed with my right hand was my belt, which was still buckled around his leg. Now keep in mind, my son's hunting accident happened in 2008. At that time, I was 59 years old and not in the prime of my life physically. My son is almost 6 feet tall and he weighed 240 pounds. Once my hand grasped a hold of that belt, I was expecting to be jerked off the platform. In my mind, I pictured being jerked off the platform in my vain attempt to try to save him from landing on his head. I was shocked to find myself looking down at my son, who was just hanging there upside down. I thought, this can't be possible. It felt like he was no heavier than a piece of paper. I kept thinking, this can't be real. So I tried to lift him up and down a few times, and it worked. I did it effortlessly. I was able to hold on to him. Next, I began to lower his body closer to the ground. I was able to get him to where his head was only about 8 feet off the ground. I was trying to figure out my next move when my son opened his eyes. We were looking at each other, when suddenly he started falling again. I thought, that can't be possible. I'm still holding on to him. Then I saw that the belt had ripped in two. I was just holding on to only a broken piece of belt. The weight of him was just too much for the belt. But because he was now conscious, he was able to move around and keep from landing on his head. To this very day, I'm in awe of what happened. Whenever I buy those 40-pound salt bags for my water softener, I think about how it would take 6 of them to add up to my son's weight of 240 pounds. Imagine tossing 6 of them tied together off a platform and then being able to reach out and grab a hold of them with one hand and be able to hang on to them. It should have been impossible for someone like me to do that. The only explanation that makes sense to me is that it was a miracle. Hanging on a wall in our home is a display case that contains the broken belt, the bloody belt, 2 halves, and other items pertaining to his hunting accident. The prominent text in the center of the display case reads, Chris III, son, my love for you is strong. I never lost my grip. I never let you go. Praise God. Love, Dad. I brought a picture of it for you to see, which I'll put in the back if you'd like to see it. Now, I suspect some of you might be thinking, all of this can be explained by adrenaline. But I can tell you it was more than adrenaline. I have experienced what adrenaline can do. Growing up, there were times when I got in fights with other kids and teenagers. That triggered an adrenaline rush. Can you imagine how those fights would have turned out if I had had the strength I had on the day that I saved my son? In Vietnam, there were times when adrenaline surged through my body. More than once, I had to race to a bunker to avoid being killed by incoming rockets and mortars. Even then, my adrenaline rush did not give me any superhuman abilities. To experience having superhuman strength is something that you never forget and you think about it. I did some checking and what I found out was very interesting. I went online and I searched for information about adrenaline and superhuman strength. I found many examples of other people who had also experienced superhuman strength. I printed off just 10 of these examples, which I brought with for you to see, and again, I'll put them in the back when I get done. What I discovered was very compelling, that these episodes of people having superhuman strength are indeed miracles, because in every example I came across, those who had experienced superhuman strength were all doing something good. I could not find any examples of someone experiencing superhuman strength doing something evil or unjust. There were no examples of things like serial killer bends bars and breaks free to avoid execution. So if anyone was thinking it was adrenaline and not a miracle that enabled me to grab a hold of my 240-pound free-falling son and hang on to him with one hand, I trust this will give you some food for thought. And speaking of miracles, in March of this year, I met a man named Ken Bloom, who was instrumental in making the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in St. Charles, Minnesota. He is a retired postal worker who had read the book, The Twins Platoon. He told me that based upon his experience as a postal worker, he thought it was a miracle that the letter I wrote to Lieutenant Peter Shriver's parents ever reached them. He had read on page 267 how my letter to his parents went to their last known address, which was 14 years old and no longer correct. They had moved from New Jersey to Florida. I think it's safe to say there is no shortage of miracles. They are all around us if we are just willing to see them for what they are. In closing, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be your guest speaker. It's truly an honor. What you as military officers have done in the past and what you are doing in the present for our country is one of the reasons our country is so great. And there are many enlisted men who benefited from your leadership in ways that you may never know. Looking back, I can see that our drill instructors had it right. Our military officers are in a special class, deserving of our respect. So, thank you.